Welcome to In Front of Ira.
With Sabrina
and Torsten.
Two historians.
And friends.
And lovers.
Of romantic comedies.
And this is the podcast in which we answer the age-old question.
Will they or won't they?
Is it or isn't it a romantic comedy?
Technically, that is still two questions.
And I still can't do this with you right now. I still love that the script
do several snarky replies, yes.
Yeah, several snarky replies. Just everyone imagine. Several snarky replies.
We left room for improvisation, and then we just never have the wherewithal.
Sometimes. Yes, today's not a day for improv. I have a comedy class all weekend. I don't want to
you don't want to spend all your improv.
I literally don't want to do this with you right now. I can talk about things. I don't want to do improv comedy.
What are we doing?
The Big Sick from 2017, which is directed by Michael Showalter, who's mostly a comedy director, who's done things like Wet Hot American Summer. That's probably the most well-known. And then notably it's written by Emily V. Gordon and Kumail Nanjiani, who are telling the real story of how they met and all the crazy circumstances that finally got them together. And Kumail Nanjiani is also playing himself. She's not playing herself. A fictional version of her is being played by Zoe Kazan.
Who is doing a really good job of it, I might add. Yeah. So it's a weird one because it is a romantic comedy. It's also a true story, and it's also quite dramatic. It's an interesting genre mix.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it is I actually talked while I was watching it yesterday, like sort of texted a friend during it. I was like, what strikes me about it that there's some points in there where I'm like, if this had not happened, I think it would be too outrageous to happen, like just as a fictional plot for a romantic comedy. Like it would be too much to cram into a regular romantic comedy script, because essentially this couple has two very big obstacles. The first big obstacle is that they have an intercultural relationship, an interracial relationship, but the specific cultural aspect is he's Pakistani, and his family practices arranged marriage and wants him to arrange a marriage with a Pakistani woman, obviously Pakistani woman that lives in the US already and all of that, and he regularly is forced to meet them. But that is obviously a big conflict because they fall in love with each other and she's white. And he fears he will basically get shunned by his family if he stays with her. And then the other big obstacle is that after that breaks the two of them apart, she falls, like has to be put into a medical coma because she develops a mystery infection. And he ends up being the contact that's gets called to the hospital and is suddenly still involved with all of this and has to sit in the hospital with her parents while for several weeks she's in this medical coma.
It's crazy enough that I think selling it as a real story, as a true story, that it is the only move that makes sense, because otherwise people would complain, oh, this is too unrealistic, which is still like there's so much to analyze there that sometimes people believe a lot of things that would never happen in real life in movies, but some things that happen in real life just don't seem true enough for movies. It's a very strange relationship.
Yes, exactly.
Veracity and verisimilitude that we have there.
I think there's something interesting happening here. So clearly, like, apparently the idea for doing this, turning this into a film, was when Kumail was a guest on Judd Apatow's podcast, like years before this, and sort of gave him the idea. And then Judd Apatow ends up producing it, and also apparently like gave script notes and stuff like that. And apparently, like, I mean, clearly when you have this autobiographical material, at some point you need to make a decision what the genre is going to be. And they clearly frame this as like, okay, it makes sense for us to do this as a romantic comedy, so we're going to do it from the meet cute to sort of the reconciliation and then this sort of happily ever after moment where we know then they will get married and we see them get married in the credits, like, you know. But I mean, obviously you could have probably picked other bits of their lives or like chosen a different framing of this, you know, could have made it more dramatic, perhaps could have played it more clearly, just about like made it a comedy more clearly, but
could have made it an episode of ER.
Yeah. Right. And or just done something about interracial dating and left out her getting ill. So I think that was just a conscious choice of like, this is where the framing comes in. And I think that's the thing where like life writes great stories, but life doesn't write narration. If that makes any sense, right?
Life is like the person who has a really good idea for a movie, but no idea how to put it in a narrative.
Exactly. And I think they succeed at turning it into a coherent narrative. And this is where I think there's some of the brilliance in this is like everything, anytime something happens, especially if it's slightly crazy or over the top or weird, is, did this actually happen? Or did they just take it and exaggerate it, which is also what you do in stand-up comedy, which obviously is also a theme in the film because he's a stand-up comedian. Or is it, you know, like, what is fiction, what isn't? But you always buy that it could be either. And I think that's the charm of it in so many ways.
And it is there have been quite a bunch of these kind of intercultural relationship, real story turned into a movie. There was a Christmas, like a Danish Christmas movie where this was done in like a very, very problematic way in which which nobody really seemed like they were a very likable person, if this is the true story, which in real life you might just actually accept. And then maybe like 10 years later, you'd go into therapy because of like how badly your parents treated your partner. But that's not obviously what we're doing here. We're telling a funny story, and they're doing it relatively successfully. Also, I think if there are things that are clearly kind of problematic things in real life, then they're not dwelling on them because they're not the things that in the end define the narrative.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think the best fictional invention that they put in is clearly the parents. Like, obviously the parents were there, but like they have both said that Emily's parents in real life are very different in terms of their characters. And they turn the parents into sort of a mirror romantic B-plot because they turn the parents into a proxy sort of intercultural relationship. Like they hint at that during a conversation. So the parents are played by Holly Hunter and Ray Romano, and Ray Romano cracks me up in this. Like,
he is so good. This is a performance that, I mean, Ray Romano is Ray Romano. He's a stand-up comedian. He is an accomplished comedic actor, and he is also professionally very likable, and somehow ends up combining all of these things into this character that really, really, really works. Like, this is, to me, I think the most surprising thing out of this movie is how much I really kind of went back to re-examining my thoughts on Ray Romano, because just based on this movie alone, I think I'm liking him like 20% more than I ever did before. Just, he does such a good job at this.
I remember having a phase, and that might have come out of this movie when, no, that's too late. But like before that, I don't know, my ex-boyfriend and I years ago came across like a series of interviews on like some of the late night talk shows with him where his whole thing is just about his sons. I think most of them are with Jimmy Kimmel. And then one of his sons actually interned with Jimmy Kimmel, and that was the whole thing. But like Ray Romano talking about his own sons and his own family is funnier than like, I mean, clearly it's also what you do in stand-up comedy once again, but it was pretty funny. And I feel like that is sort of the energy he channels into this. He just gets to be sort of a dad, like, you know, obviously, like the intercultural bit between him and Holly Hunter is less, but like, I mean, they're both white, but she I mean, sort of convincingly brings it up, frames it as like, oh, they were so wrong for each other because she's from the South, she's from this like Southern military family. He had a thick New York accent. So clearly there is like within the US that can lead to conflict. And you said, oh, how do you get over this? And it's like just a lot of uncomfortable family dinners, like just, which then Kumail at some point takes as a like sort of inspiration to not let himself get kicked out of his family, and sits down and like sort of forces himself back in and says, I'm gonna take that. But no, just I think putting them as a romantic B plot works super well. It is also a complete invention that it turns out that like the father has cheated on the mother. And this has caused a rift between them, but because their daughter is sick, they obviously have to like pull through it, and that actually ends up sort of
that's the kind
them
of
back together.
thing that the movie needs, right? You need a narration, you need characters to have an arc, and you also, if you're doing a good movie, your minor characters or your like not main characters will also have arcs. So that really works. I think I kind of want to go back and like set up this whole thing a little bit, because we obviously just saw this movie, so we're like versed in it and kind of living in that world. But so it starts off with Kumail Nanjiani's like stand-up career, just kind of like showing how he's around there. There's a lot of like real kind of stand-up comedians or actors slash stand-up comedians in this.
I need to say, like, it is the typical open mic stand-up setup that's very realistic, because the MC for the night is currently doing coke in the bathroom. There's a white guy that's just bad. He's just really bad. He's trying. He's also his roommate. And then there's Bo Burnham and Aidy Bryant. It's like, okay, I'm buying this. It's like,
it's some of even the bad bits are actually kind of funny, because you're like, oh yeah, I can see how like you had like a good idea and then you just couldn't land. Like there's like a throwaway joke that one of them makes. I bought a laser printer, printed out 6 lasers already. Like this is the exact dumb line that would kind of like a stand-up comedian would bring out on stage. And if you're a good comedian, it's a funny line. If you're not, it's not. And so Kumail Nanjiani is a stand-up comedian and is doing his bits, and Zoe Kazan is at one of the bits and basically woohoos at some point when he asks if there are Pakistanis in the house. And obviously she's very white and very blonde and doesn't look Pakistani at all. And so they kind of get into like this banter where he's like,
is it heckling? By the way, it is heckling, even if you woohoo.
Which we learn from this movie.
Which is also the nice frame, because again, sort of that. I like the meet cute of like, I heckled a comedian, I heckled the stand-up comedian, and this is how we met. This is coincidentally also how I will obviously become Brett Goldstein's wife at some point, because I heckled him really well. But no, like I think that, and they use it again like as a frame. But before they get to the end where she gets to heckle him again, and then they end up together, there's a lot happening in between.
There's a lot happening in between. And yeah, their relationship is really kind of defined, I think, and first kind of in like a facetious way by him saying like they can't be together more than 2 days in a row because like this can't happen, or her not wanting to be with him. Like they kind of like realized that neither of them really should be with this person. He has his obviously problems with his family and the idea of the arranged marriage and the fact that his family will disown him if he does not follow through with that. She has her grad studies, which as somebody who's been in graduate school just never quite feels right for telling people that you're not dating them. I mean, it might actually be a real reason. It just always feels like an excuse. Like, I know we all have a lot of work to do. But if you're right for someone, I don't know.
I think it's an excuse also, and we get the idea it's an excuse because she does tell us that she already was married, like, even though she's very young.
Which we learn later.
She was already married, so it feels like an excuse. She's doesn't feel ready for another big relationship, but it takes both of them by surprise, and then they have to deal with that. And But yeah, so basically after she heckles him, he talks to her at the bar, and then they end up going back to his place and having a one-night stand, or like what should be a one-night stand, and obviously it's not, which is very funny because it ends with her leaving in the middle of the night and calling an Uber, but he ends up being her Uber driver because being a stand-up comedian, this is not paying his bills, which is also why he has a roommate. I think the one thing that is very clear is that they're at this point must be in their like mid-20s, because of everything. But obviously, Kumail Nanjiani playing himself is older, so like at some point it's like, yeah, this makes sense for a mid-20s guy. And I mean, he doesn't look way too old, but like,
yeah,
you need to like think about it.
I think we have like a little bit of the thing we had with Moonstruck, where it's not entirely clear how old anyone is actually supposed to be.
You can gather that they must be mid-20s, because again, she's talking about a grad work. He's clearly just trying out. He's still at an age where, you know, like you still hold on to trying to do this as a career and you're not sure if it's going to happen. And to be fair, there's a lot of people in their 30s who are still trying to be stand-up comedians and might never be successful enough to sustain themselves. But then they do this as a side hustle, whereas he's really trying at this point still to make a living, and then does Uber driving too.
Yeah, and he has a one-man show, which he performs for his friend, which I love the way that this is framed, because it's basically all about what life is like in Pakistan and explaining Pakistani history and culture. And you think it at some point is going to get like personal or is going to get funny, and it just does not.
It's just a lecture.
It's just basically a lecture, and not a very good one on things that happen in Pakistan. Here you are. And by not being very funny, it is actually incredibly funny, because everybody reacts. Like all his friends, including his now date, do not like this at all, and then have to like pretend that they did. It feels real.
It sort of reminded me of every time in like earlier Friends seasons when everyone goes to see one of Joey's plays.
Yes. Exactly.
But I couldn't find out if Kumail actually did this. I sort of assume there was a version of this. I think obviously his stand-up is very informed by talking about being Pakistani. I also think that sort of these bits where you can... that comes back in certain ways, especially because this is clearly like early 2000s, where 9/11 was much more fresh in people's minds when this is set, because of going back to when they met versus when they write it. Because there's like two moments that aren't even far apart from each other. The first one is Ray Romano. Just when they're first time at the hospital together, and just having awkward lunch in the cafeteria after her mom is sending him away, because the parents know that they just broke up, and he just got pulled back into this whole mess because he was called when she was admitted to the hospital. So
even though they were not together anymore, because she found out that he has not told his family about her, and has kind of explained that they can't be together.
Like the narrative is they obviously start dating despite knowing they shouldn't try to do this right now. And sometimes she finds out he's supposed to have an arranged marriage, which he kept from her. And then that causes them to break up, because it's just like, can you imagine a world where we can be together? And then he says some shitty things to her, and then they break up. And then shortly after she gets this mystery infection, he's sort of listed as the contact, where I think her friends actually, because they're studying for finals, are like, we can go to the hospital right now, but she's ill, like you come in. And then he ends up suddenly being the one person who's at the hospital, and has to sign that the doctor gets to put her into a medical coma and is completely overwhelmed.
He has to pretend he's her husband, because the doctor basically like needs someone to sign off, and like makes him are you the husband? Tell me.
Yeah, you need to sign this, because otherwise she might die. And then the parents obviously get called in, and once they're there, they're here. And then there's this conflict. But they end up sitting together at the cafeteria, because you get the idea the dad is like feeling bad for him, and it's like, okay, he's still he obviously has feelings for my daughter, otherwise he wouldn't have stayed and he wouldn't be here. Yeah. And then they have this very awkward conversation where he's like, how's your sandwich? And then Ray Romano gets to do a bit about how tuna is always a gamble, which is the funniest. But then he is like trying to make awkward conversation and arrives at, so how about 9/11?
Are you for or against it? Like, yeah.
And then obviously, like, because it's Kumail is, like he's a brown person, and it's like, no, Pakistanis had nothing to do with it anyway. And it's very funny, but it's also obviously this thing. But they get sort of redeemed in the sense because then they hang out and it's very awkward, and they're trying to then it turns out Emily has to have surgery, I think, like a day later. They end up hanging out together and just don't know what to do with themselves and try to distract themselves. Like his mom is trying to read up on the surgery, but Kumail has a gig, so they end up coming to the gig, and that gig escalates because he gets heckled by some asshole who goes, "Go back to ISIS," and like her mom is like, "What the fuck are you even saying? You want one more person to be in ISIS?" And he tries to just play it down because I mean this happens all the time, right? Like, wait, let's not turn this into a thing, but then it really escalates because obviously, like, they're also really on edge. But this is how they end up bonding, actually, and then sort of let him stay, and they talk about Emily, and then all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's quite the interesting thing to me about this movie, for a movie called The Big Sick, which is coming, which is kind of central to this movie, comes in at minute 40. Like, it comes in like, really, really late.
They put her into a coma.
Yeah.
I also
like
looked,
she gets a call at like minute 40. There's a little bit of a tease ahead when she has kind of problems with her foot when they're in a supermarket earlier, and like it's like if you know how movies work,
the missing piece of that she has
information,
still like disease. It's like an episode of House MD. It's like
exactly, yeah. And if you know how these movies work, you're like, oh, they're setting this up, but it comes in relatively late, so which I think it really also has to, because we do need to see them together and need to see that they're good together. They're awkward together. They're kind of like, this is the thing that I really noticed about this movie. It doesn't really try to make its characters look better than they are. Like, in terms of like this being a real story, I feel like they kept a bunch of the edges. They might have sanded them off, but like, he doesn't always come across as the most thoughtful person. She doesn't always come across as the nicest person. The way that she deals with him, they seem very real, and they still seem like they're actually good for each other, which to me is something that you don't really often see in movies that aren't meant to be, like dramatic and like, kind of like the we talked in The Sleepless in Seattle, because the director of photography did Scenes of a Marriage. That kind of movie, you'd see like these things that make you think that people are real people and they're not always the best versions of themselves. And you see that here as they're falling in love, which I think is actually an interesting choice.
Yeah, and I think it obviously comes from them writing this together about themselves and are clearly like honest enough with each other, about themselves, probably, to like, we both almost fucked this up for various reasons, but that is actually like a key plot thing, because again, he's very shitty to her. You're like keeping the arranged marriage thing from her, and then the way that escalates. The fight also feels very real because it gets very ugly very quickly, and also, I mean, again, with the perspective of them being probably mid-20s, it's just very high stakes also to put on a new relationship, but especially if you're that age. And so yeah, it definitely feels very real, and I mean, yeah, both the parents are also just great, and it's sort of, and all the awkwardness also from like when the relationship between the parents sort of falls apart again, because we learn he cheated on her, and that marriage is on thin ice, and then we get that scene where the dad just sleeps over at his and awkwardly tells him about the fact that he cheated on his wife, and this is like, why did I need this information? It's sort of all of these very real, like, this is a very weird situation to be in moments. And even though the Ray Romano's best line is definitely like, that's why they call love, because it's difficult. And Kumail is like, I don't get that. It's
That
like,
makes
I
no
don't,
sense.
I just like started saying things hoping they would like, would be smart. It's like, yeah.
That's life. That's life
Yeah,
for you.
I think we both made a career out of like opening our mouth and hoping something smart would come out, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. Which
Yeah,
is
and then
also
we
this podcast.
keep
Yeah,
doing this for all the world to see. So
yeah,
sorry, world. I actually like. I'm gonna very controversially come in and say that that's not his best line. I think his best line is, "You feel a coma coming on, call us." Like when after she comes
oh
back,
yeah,
which I think is it for me was kind of like a cathartic thing because it makes you realize that they're now kind of like out of the woods. Maybe that's why I responded to it so well. Um, Generally, Ray Romano is just he's again we've already said this, but his deliveries are just always spot on. Like
yeah. Tuna is always a gamble. I'm sorry, it's just like
yeah,
so
there's
funny.
no tuna in the lake.
Yeah, no tuna in the lake. Threw a dice. ah, um, and
Yeah. There's an interesting element that I think is also helps frame this, which are the awkward family dinners where he always goes
yeah.
to his Pakistani family. His brother is already married in an arranged marriage. His parents obviously are in an arranged marriage,
And they seem happy with them. I
they
think that is an important
they seem
point,
fine.
that they love their partners and they get on with their
Yeah,
partners, because
which actually
that is
kind of
also
reminded me of the arranged marriage one from When Harry Met Sally, which also then ended up being a good relationship. And then his mother keeps trying to set him up with all these Pakistani women who just happen to have drop by their house, which is in a cul-de-sac, so like clearly not just happen to drop by, and
also
him
great line.
trying to like just basically find reasons not to be with any of them, and she keeps getting more desperate, not understanding why he's refusing all of these women, and that's just kind of constantly repeated. I think every single dinner has like somebody come in and him awkwardly having to reject yet another woman that has been meant for him.
There was actually some controversy about the depiction of Desi women in this film, because they're mostly stereotypes, obviously, of this, and put in for comic relief. I think that comes from the perspective of him just seeing it that way when he was that age, and then like sort of not escaping it. He has said that he would do it differently now because he does understand that this is a bad look, because his community is so rarely depicted on screen, and I think otherwise the family is depicted very well, but it's still tapping into certain tropes. And then also the casting isn't always like great with that, because Vala Lowell is like mixed race, black,
quite
like
she comes in
with a bad, like not the best Pakistani accent to be on committed to screen. So
which kind of really like I was very confused by seeing her there, because of like, wait, she looks familiar, but like it can't be because she's not Pakistani, and then it being Vala Lovell, obviously from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and many other things, and doing that Pakistani accent, and the fact that she's kind of cast as the one of these women who actually has some agency, who actually has a point of view, who actually we follow up on a little bit more than any of the others. That felt like a weird choice.
Even though she disses the X-Files, which is not okay. But I think it's clearly like his family comes off. Clearly his family comes off better, even though Kumail said like his family at no point, especially his mom, at no point threatened to actually cut him out of the family. So they definitely exaggerated this. It's not like he wasn't scared that it would cause issues, and it did also cause issues, him wanting to date a white woman, but it didn't quite go to the place the movie went, even though in the movie we clearly get the sense that they will work this out, and then we see the actual wedding pictures of them at the end of the film. And I think although that scene I think is very cute, because he decides to move to New York to pursue stand-up comedy, clearly more as he can do in Chicago at that point. And and his parents come to see him off, and his mom has cooked biryani for him and doesn't want to speak to him. She's in a car, but she doesn't want to speak to him. So his dad comes over and is like, I'm not allowed to hug you, and your mom is not speaking to you, and she's clearly like not looking at you, but here's this food she made especially for you, and like, you know, and you are cut out of the family, but please text us when you get safely to New York. So it's sort of this, like, they're clearly like trying to stick to their guns, but they also don't want to lose their son, and we get the sense it will obviously like pan out.
Yeah. But not too easily. I think that's the implication as well.
Yeah.
This is going to take some time.
And also, I mean, some of the actors in the family, they're not Pakistani, they're Indian, which is obviously a whole big political issue. But apparently Kumail didn't mind, nor did his father, who specifically wanted Anupam Kher to play his dad. And Anupam Kher is like a massive, massive Bollywood actor. So I think he was just very flattered. And apparently he also only took the role when he heard his father had explicitly wanted him to do this. Maybe also because of the whole India-Pakistan thing.
Which was in the one-man show. Like, if you watch the one-man show, you know all about it.
No, I think, there's some stuff there. But at the same time, like, I think the criticism, again, comes from the fact that the community is so rarely depicted on screen anyway, that like he could have taken more care, or like they could have overall taken more care.
Which I think is a fair criticism to make, and you see this with a lot of underrepresented communities, but it often tends to go into, this is horrible, they shouldn't have done it, they should have not done this at all, which I think at that point then turns kind of like flips around.
It doesn't feel like that what happened. It was mostly like, look, the women in this from your community don't come across well. The women come across much better because they're also represented by his brother, and I think they're very likable. Also, that his brother is very funny, and I think that was also the thing. Not just him, who's literally doing comedy for a living, but that's like. Because he also said, especially like Muslim people are portrayed as terribly serious at all times, which is the other representation that's in this film. Whereas like he wanted to sidestep that, because even the more devout Muslims that his family obviously is, even his brother, are like very funny, and they're still like, you know, it's especially again at a time that is closer to 9/11, not that it, like, you know, Islamophobia has stopped or
but it's clearly a different thing in the George W. Bush years.
And I think that's when it's set, right? So it feels like that's in there definitely.
I thought one of the very interesting choices that this movie makes is when she comes out of the coma, because spoiler alert, she survives, it's a romantic comedy, and she obviously does not remember him being there. She was in a coma. That's the whole point of it. She was in a medically induced coma. He signed that form. Like, it's very clear that that's what they were doing, and was in it for quite a while. And obviously he bonded with the parents. He spent a lot of time with her, did a lot of things technically for her, and she was not there for any of it. So he has this strange familiarity, I guess, with her still, or again, that she does not have with him. Her last memory of him is them breaking up and him being the worst person in the world. And his memory is he basically did everything he could to save her, or like to be with her. And so they're playing that in a very interesting kind of like drawn out manner of them slowly maybe coming together again, which is more interesting than just kind of a either like a full kind of her turning against him, like you're not meant to be here at all, because she does come around very quickly, and it's also not a immediate happy ending, which is also nice.
Yeah, I think it's that thing we've said before, where these things become more believable if the time frames are believable. So we get the sense that there's a few months of them like really hitting it off, and then it coming to an abrupt halt. And that gets enough time. Again, like it takes 40 minutes for her to end up in the hospital. And then obviously you have a long stretch of what amounts to, I think they say she's in a coma for 2 weeks. But obviously when you're in this, things like that feel so much longer. And so it makes complete sense to have this like drawn out, obviously not real time drawn out, but like certain things just feel longer, and it's this high stakes situation and things happen a lot and very quickly, but at the same time is just not passing. So I think that makes sense. And then when she comes out, he's obviously a changed man and she's not. I mean, she's too, because she went through this, but in a different way. It doesn't relate to her relationship. She even, when they talk again, says like, you're supposed to have this new lease on life when you experience something like this, but it's basically, I'm just too tired to do things. It's like the thing, right?
I wasn't there for my dramatic story of being saved.
And but at least we get the sense that he now has the support of the parents, and he sees that he also fucked up. And in the meantime, and that is sort of a nice plot device, so we don't have to rehash things that the audience has already seen, is that she finds out apparently about him having actually told his parents, even though they were broken up, about her and all of that, and not wanting arranged marriage while she was in the coma. And she finds out because she watches the time he bombed to audition for the Montreal Comedy Festival, because that happens to be when it looks like she might be dying, and he just has a complete mental breakdown on stage, which is again one of those things where like I could Google now if this really happened, but it doesn't matter because it's believable that it would happen. Like you, at some point, you just can't go on and do your job anymore.
Yeah. I kind of wonder if a lot of times people approach Kumail Nanjiani and ask him about, things that happen in his life that actually didn't happen in his life, but only happened in the movie. I think that must happen quite a lot.
Probably. But it's the same, again, if you do stand-up comedy, you usually use bits from your actual life and exaggerate them to a point where they might be lies or like very, very different versions of what happened.
There's a wonderful
this whole controversy about Hassan Minaj I don't want to get into, but it was basically the same thing. I'm like, did you think stand-up comedians were just,
and it's entertainment. It's the entertainment industry. There's a wonderful part in the new Lauren Graham book that you gave me, where she talks about going on Jay Leno for the first time, and she had actually accidentally met Jay Leno on the Hollywood freeways when she was a struggling actress, and he had helped her along or something, or said something to her, whatever. And she goes on the show, and in the pre-interview, they ask her, "Oh, are there any stories?" And she's like, "Oh, I got this great story." And they're like, "Great, let's do this story. But can you say you were in a different car, like in a car brand that they think is funnier?" And so Lauren Graham has this whole big thing of like, what is like, how true is the truth, and like what part of the true stories that people tell are actually true stories, which ones are completely made up, which ones are just this side of made up. And it just raises this really interesting question about how we as a society look at celebrity, and especially look at people who are in the public eye and whose job it is to entertain you, and to assume that every story that they tell is exactly true is kind of detrimental to us. But there's no authority that says that Flash is like, this is a work of fiction when you're in an interview. So this is a very interesting, I mean, that's kind of what the controversy surrounding Hassan Minaj was about, and it's like that for so many.
I think it's also different. I think if I watch an interview with someone on a talk show, I assume that what happened is real, but I do know that they might have told the same story over and over again, so they started to like cut it a bit, embellish it a bit, whatever. But like if you do a full stand-up bit, I'm fully aware that you also did the same process, but even more so to find the jokes in the thing that happened that meant you were going to exaggerate this. And I knew this before. I was literally doing a workshop on this, like last weekend and this weekend, doing a stand-up comedy workshop. And we were talking about this. It's like, yes, you obviously start out with things that are true about you, probably, and you exaggerate them, and you go to the bits where it doesn't make any sense, or like where it didn't happen. It's like, oh, I hate this part of town. I even broke up with someone because they were from this part of town. And it's like, well, that didn't actually happen. Like, yes, I was with someone who was from there. That didn't help because it's a certain type of person, but it didn't actually break up with them because they were from there. That's just the funny part of it, right? But that's the thing. And it's like, obviously we want to believe that, like, I don't know, stand-up comedians or whatever, it feels like they're talking about themselves, and they do to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And
in a
again,
way,
it's fictionalized.
In a way, it's not any, and I think as people on the internet today, everybody presents themselves in a certain kind of way. We do this right now. Like, we did things before this podcast, and we're going to do things after that are very different from what we're doing right now. And what you get to hear and see from us is this, right? And just that, just taking that out and reframing it is something that changes your perception.
And I mean, we don't edit this heavily, but we could, right? We could all at any point in time feel like, oh, let's edit this out, let's edit this, and let's put this joke in that I wrote down before, because it came to me while I was writing the notes, which I've definitely done at some point, and you probably couldn't have told if it just come to me in the second or if I had it there since yesterday or 2 weeks before. It, like that's sort of the deal with.
But it's also kind of how people talk, right? You are in a conversation and maybe you think of something witty to say, but there's no way to say it right now. And then you wait, and like 3 minutes later, somebody mentions someone, and then you put it in, and it sounds like it just, happened to come out of your brain at this moment in time, and it didn't. And it's just a question of calibration, right? What version of the truth is this medium for? And obviously, if we're writing academic papers, that's a very different standard than just throwing things out on a podcast or a stand-up set. Which is not to say that we're not doing our research and trying to be as accurate as possible on this podcast. But we don't have peer review, and we don't have fact checkers on this. It's just us.
If, by the way, if you're listening to this and you think one of us said something very wrong, or know that whatever we presented as a fact about a background info for a film, and you happen to know that's not true, that's sort of like an urban myth or something, then just tell us, because like we also could just go off like basic things of the internet. I'm not offended if someone wants to fact check me on something I said. But anyway, like I think what the film does really well is make us believe that this is a true story, because it was, and let us buy everything that's in it. And I think that's the thing. And it still packages it in a believable, contained rom-com narrative. And I think it does that very well. I said before, like in the beginning, so I'm going to frame it with that. The meet cute is she heckles him at stand-up. Towards the end, they start to rekindle, but she isn't quite ready for it because, again, she hasn't gone through the same experience. Then he ends up deciding to move to New York. And then we see him do a stand-up gig in New York, and she reveals herself to be in the audience and woos again, and they have the same sort of conversation as like, oh, if you're woo, I didn't heckle you, I just wooed. And
this is one of the things I have always liked. I like when you come back to like the touchstone, like when you, in the end, you land where you need to land. Every piece of media to me is made better if you have an ending that kind of is prefigured in some way. It's just my personal preference.
It also almost a bit reminded of Notting Hill, even though like with the less massive stakes. But I think it's probably inspired by that. But because I don't think
let's talk also about inspiration, because when Harry Met Sally looms over this movie, like it's obviously it's a romantic comedy movie in the mold of it, but like they're starting off in Chicago. She's a graduate student at the University of Chicago. That's kind of like
I wrote down Chicago to New York as an important journey to make in a
station wagon, right?
Yeah.
It's clearly there's a baseball scene in the baseball batting cages, which is very clearly, like in terms of the visuals, influenced by Harry and Jess in When Harry Met Sally. So it
feels like
is a movie that's aware of it.
Sort of that male best friend role.
He's Bruno Kirby-ish at times.
Yeah.
So
they've done their homework. They were like, at some point they decided they were going to turn their actual story into rom-com, and then looked at like what rom-coms are there, what do they do well, all of that. And I think that that really helps because again, you could have picked a different genre for the story, and
Hugh Grant
that's the genre they picked.
Hugh Grant is directly referenced when Kumail Nanjiani, when they look at like his old childhood photos, and he has like this floppy hair, and he admits to her that Hugh Grant was the inspiration for this. Which, I mean, what Hugh Grant would have, that would have been Notting Hill era Hugh Grant, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think that it succeeds in being a romantic comedy because they clearly set out to write one, even though they were going off their real lives. And I think that is that's just the hallmark of stand-up comedy. You take the things that happen to you and then narrativize them and fictionalize them into the bit they want to do. And if you succeed in a way where nobody can tell anymore if what happens right now on screen is fictional
including you,
then you were doing well. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah, there's one more scene before we do like our typical things that we always do.
Yeah.
One more scene that I really need to reference because it shows so beautifully his unraveling, which is the 4 slices of cheese scene where he goes to the drive-thru and he wants a burger with 4 slices of cheese. That's just what he wants. And the guy who's working the burger fast food drive-through counter who's there for his first day is like, we don't do that. Like, nobody has told him like that this might be possible, and like he doesn't know how to. I completely understand that. Like, you start working somewhere, you hope nobody has any special wishes, right? Because you only know the things you've been trained to do.
Also, having a special wish like on your food, where have you heard that before, right?
Yeah, right. And that's just, he's just completely like screaming at this poor kid. Because he just wants one burger with 4 slices of cheese, and in the end, he kicks over a trash can, and the guy in the end just like, we're just going to charge you for 4 burgers, and like it's resolved.
Yeah.
But it clearly shows like how emotionally involved he is in her well-being, and the whole situation, which at this point is kind of at its bleakest. It's kind of like the moment, like the end of Act 2 moment, where everything looks like it's going to go to crap.
Yeah. But yeah, so the tagline for this film is an awkward true story. But yeah, I think
just
pretty much
I guess
that's what it is. Also, by the way, this actually has dethroned Moonstruck immediately as the highest rated film we've talked about, because it has a 98% Rotten Tomatoes.
That's not even Sleepless in Seattle doesn't even have that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Critics really loved this. It also was a Sundance film that immediately got one of the highest bids. Was sold for 12 million, which is one of the highest things anything was sold for at Sundance, at least up to that point.
I think the part it's not like it's not a romantic comedy, but also it's not just a romantic comedy, right? It has kind of a genre mixed in it. It has that medical emergency, like high stakes thing in it, which you would see in a drama. And because like these medical like coma or whatever, like that's played for laughs and while you were sleeping. Like you never assume that anything bad is going to happen to the guy that Sandra Bullock is ostensibly in love with in while you were sleeping when he's in a coma. You're clearly invested in the story here in Zoe Kazan's character.
Even though you probably think she's not gonna die, you're still, because you know it's real, you know that like really bad things could happen here, especially when they have discussion of like moving her from the hospital, and the nurse is like, do not move her.
Yeah, like, and then they want to move her.
Yeah, and then can, because it's her condition is worsening anyway.
Yeah, that got me. That really got me. Like emotionally, I was like, "Oh wow!"
Yeah,
not like romantic comedies usually get me, which is kind of like more in like an awe way. This got me in like the way that like a really good episode of a medical drama gets you.
Yeah, and but I guess the stakes for what was also funny to me now in retrospect. So again, this is obviously the thing that also made Kumail Nanjiani a much bigger name, and he to the point where he was cast in a Marvel film, and then that Marvel film happened to flop. It's one of the first ones that really flopped, And now he's sort of back. I mean, he has always been doing stand-up comedy. Like, I mean, LA has a huge stand-up comedy scene.
He was also a best friend in romantic comedies before this. I recently watched The Late Bloomer, which is kind of like one of those like rom-com adjacent, also kind of, I think, based on a true story things where he is one of the best friends. And you can see how he progresses from that to romantic comedy lead.
Yeah, and now they're they just announced, we could say obviously still together, or like happily still together, that him and his wife will write another romantic comedy. So it feels like there's this trajectory where that's where they start out and obviously do it very well, but they're clearly going off material they know, but have apparently now progressed to a point where like, actually, like, we did well with this, let's go back to that. And this is the thing where we keep coming back to, nobody's doing romantic comedies. I'm actually very excited that they will try to do one, and hopefully it should have the means and the connections, because I think Judd Apatow might throw money at it again, and he has money. Like, so hopefully there's actually, now we're hopefully back to sort of maybe having a little renaissance of the genre, because enough people in the industry have been fed up with them not being made, so the people that actually have the money themselves will start making them enough. And like, so that's really funny. And yeah, and then my other context for him is back to him. Basically, I see him pop up at like comedy gigs, or like at the Largo in LA where I've been, and like do pop up for mixed stand-up nights hosted by Brett Goldstein or Mae Martin or whatever. Like, he's been in, that's the context he's been in. But that's also Judd Apatow, like, is at that venue sometimes.
I mean, that's a whole scene that this movie kind of grows out of.
Yeah.
Tagline, fake taglines. We got the real one. What's your fake tagline?
My fake tagline is I actually wrote it down during my notes before I knew the real one. So it's sort of very close to the awkward true story. But because the line in there where they break up and she's like, can you imagine a world in which we end up together? And like, I would go off that and say, yes, real life.
Yeah. Mine is another quote. They're not always that successful. I think this one is really successful. The good kind of coma.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, again, close third place, maybe. Tuna's always a gamble.
Yeah.
Through the dice.
Yeah. Shout out to the comedic stylings of Ray Romano, who is the...
Or like love, they call love because it's not easy. Yeah.
There's one line of dialogue that stuck with me, which is from their courtship, and when you realize that they're really kind of meant for each other, where she says, I am completely overwhelmed by you, and then he says back, I am also completely overwhelmed by you, which feels like this is a line that kind of has staying power. I haven't seen it pop up anywhere, but I feel like it should and it could. It's one of those that really kind of feels like in the canon, especially because she really, love declarations.
When he throws it back at her and she's like, that's a very weird thing to say. And I was like, I just repeated what you said. So which also makes me think or hope once again that this is maybe something they actually said to each other. And even if not, it's a great line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so that's the Big Sick, and just in case you didn't know, something like 14 million hectares are being irrigated in Pakistan, and as soon as I learned that, I thought I needed to put it in the podcast.